There are days when clarity disappears without warning. The path that once seemed sure suddenly folds into fog. What once felt divinely confirmed now feels eerily quiet. But this kind of silence, it's never random. It's not punishment. It's not spiritual neglect. It's something far more intentional than that. Not because you've gone off course, but because something higher has stepped back to see what you'll do when the map is no longer glowing. This isn't abandonment. It's arrangement. When the moon drifts far from the sun, the light that once made everything obvious becomes indirect, unreachable. And that distance in the sky mirrors something deeper, something sacred. Because sometimes, heaven pulls back just enough to see who still stands. Who still listens without confirmation. Who still obeys without signs. This is not a test of belief. It's a test of posture. A test of whether your spirit can remain aligned even when your senses are offered nothing to hold on to. Genesis 22 didn't begin with a miracle. It began with silence. And God tested Abraham, that was the whole setup. Before the ram, before the mountain, before the altar, there was a silence so loaded with purpose that it split time. And that same silence is here again. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just real. Just present. Because when the light steps back, everything hidden in you steps forward. Guidance has not stopped. It's just changed its shape. What used to arrive in signs now arrives in silence. And the first instinct, in moments like this, is to assume something is wrong. But it isn't. This isn't a withdrawal of love. It's a reconfiguration of light. Because silence from heaven doesn't always mean absence, it sometimes means calibration. When the divine pulls back, it's not because it's gone. It's because you're being observed. Not judged. Not punished. Just witnessed. The presence hasn't left. It's holding its breath to see what you'll do without the glow. This is where trust is revealed. Not in the fire of inspiration, but in the chill that comes when it's gone. The energetic vacuum around you right now is not a void. It's a mirror. And what you see inside it might not be what you expected. Because when the voice stops speaking, when the signs stop lining up, when even your own intuition feels strangely delayed, that's when your real posture is exposed. Not the one you perform. The one you return to by default. It's easy to call it a dark night of the soul. Easy to say you're under attack. But what if it's something more precise than that? What if this is the moment designed to show you how much of your obedience was driven by reward? How much of your discernment was just reading confirmations? How much of your spiritual rhythm was actually dependent on external light? There are seasons where faith feels like a dialogue. Where every movement you make is echoed by a sign, a blessing, a ripple. And then there are moments like this, where heaven goes still not because it's angry, but because it wants to know, can you keep walking when you're not being reassured every step of the way? Because trust doesn't mean moving in certainty. It means moving without it. It means your loyalty remains even when your clarity doesn't. It means your posture stays aligned even when your intuition flickers. The glow was never the point. The voice was never the source. They were just ways the divine chose to speak while you were learning how to hear. But now, it's quiet. The map has dimmed. The breadcrumbs have stopped falling. And that's not a flaw in the system. It's the center of the test. When Moses ascended the mountain, the people below panicked. They built something they could see. Something they could touch. Because silence is threatening when you're not used to holding your own alignment. But the ones who ascend, they wait. They stay present in the uncertainty. They don't manufacture revelation. They wait for it to arrive in its own timing. You're in that same pause now. Not because you've failed, but because you're being invited to go deeper. To locate the parts of yourself that only come online when the external support system fades. Think of it like this, the training wheels are off. And now the divine wants to see if you've internalized the rhythm or if you were just mimicking what was being mirrored to you. This is the moment that reveals who walks by trust, and who was just walking by feedback. And it's humbling to see it. To realize how much of your faith was actually dependency. How much of your spiritual strength was just being fed by constant confirmation. The silence strips that away, not to shame you, but to strengthen what's real. Because what you learn to hold in silence, you get to carry in power. But first, you have to survive the stillness without turning it into noise. That's where most people fail. They fill the gap. They chase new signs. They interpret every flicker of emotion as a message. They replace divine stillness with spiritual performance. But this test doesn't care how well you interpret energy. It cares whether you can stay centered when there's nothing to interpret at all. There's a kind of quietness that reveals everything loud in you. A kind of stillness that exposes every craving for certainty. That's what this space is. It's surgical. Not harsh, but precise. It cuts away the fluff. It reveals whether your alignment is internalized or just borrowed from your environment. And when the echo finally comes, when the whisper returns, you'll know you didn't earn it by striving. You attracted it by waiting. This isn't the time to prove anything. It's the time to stay empty long enough to receive something new. Because what's coming next can't land in the version of you that still needs constant feedback. It needs the you that doesn't flinch when heaven goes quiet. The you that knows the absence is artificial. That the silence is sacred. That what looks like a pause is really a test of spiritual muscle. You're not being ignored. You're being trusted. Trusted with the kind of quiet that forges prophets. Trusted with the kind of stillness that only heaven can measure. And it's not measuring how fast you move. It's measuring how deeply you listen, especially when there's nothing speaking. So if the light feels distant, don't chase it. Stay exactly where you are. Breathe slower. Move slower. Watch what rises in the absence. That's where the truth is. That's what this day was built for. Because the ones who can sit inside the gap are the ones who carry the message when it finally returns. You are not alone in this silence. And you know it, not because someone is speaking, but because something is watching. Not loudly. Not urgently. Just watching. The kind of observation you can't see with your eyes, but feel in the back of your spirit. The atmosphere around you isn't just still, it's attentive. As if the moment itself has turned into a lens, focusing not on what you say, but how you sit in the quiet. This is not paranoia. This is spiritual awareness. The sensation that what once pursued you is no longer chasing, but it hasn't disappeared. It stepped back into the shadows to measure, not to act. To study what you do now that you're no longer being pulled. And this kind of attention doesn't come from enemies. It comes from old patterns. From past soul ties. From people you've grown out of, systems you've walked away from, and energies that once had access to you, but no longer do. They're not reaching for you. They're scanning. Not with malice, but with memory. Because the old version of you was accessible. Predictable. And now, you've changed frequency. You're quieter. Clearer. Harder to track. And that shift has consequences. Because when you stop showing up where you used to be, those who fed on that version of you don't always leave. Sometimes they linger. Sometimes they circle. Not to reclaim you, but to see if you'll revert. You might feel it as pressure with no source. As a sudden emotional spike with no trigger. You're fine, and then you're not. You're grounded, and then you're spun. There's no event to point to. But your body knows something's brushing close. Something familiar, but wrong. A sensation you thought you'd outgrown, now flickering back through your field, not to stay, but to test. These are echoes of old contracts. Old agreements. Old attachments. They don't knock. They don't speak. They just hover. Like someone scrolling your soul from a distance, looking for signs that you still respond to the same bait. The same fear. The same guilt. The same emotional code you used to live by. And what's haunting is not their presence, it's their silence. Because silence is a strategy. If they spoke, you'd recognize the voice. You'd call it out. But silence lets them stay for just a little longer. Close enough to observe. Far enough not to be expelled. That's why this kind of moment feels heavier than it should. Why your dreams feel watched. Why your thoughts drift into scenarios you thought were over. You're not crazy. You're being read. Energetically scanned. Spiritually assessed. Not to destroy you, but to understand what you've become. This is what Luke 22 verse 31 points to when it says, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. Not to attack. Not to assault. Just to sift. To shake and see what separates. To test if what remains after the shaking is still the version they knew, or something else entirely. That's what sifting is. It's not an explosion. It's a filtering. A quiet sorting. And you're in it now. Not because you're under threat, but because your evolution has triggered attention. You don't move into higher states of clarity without something noticing. And when heaven pulls back to watch your response, other things do too. So what do they see? Do they see the old pattern still trying to survive? The old wound still flinching in the dark? The old habit creeping back in through the crack of uncertainty? Or do they see something new? Someone still. Someone centered. Someone who no longer reacts just because the air turned cold for a moment. That's the true test of this silence. Not whether you're safe, but whether you've stabilized. Whether the version of you that's emerging can hold itself in the presence of what used to trigger collapse. Because this kind of spiritual surveillance doesn't last forever. It's seasonal. Brief. But revealing. It shows you where you still leak. Where your energy still spirals. Where the doors are still unlocked. And it doesn't ask permission. It just watches. The only thing you control in this moment is your frequency. Your response. Your stability. You can't stop the eyes that linger in the spirit, but you can make sure there's nothing in you that matches their invitation. You can refine your resonance until they realize the signal they came looking for no longer exists. That's how you pass the test. Not by shouting that you're free, but by living like it when no one's checking. When no one's affirming. When no one's congratulating. That's where integrity is formed. Not in front of applause, but in the quiet weight of observation. Because silence isn't always about you hearing less. Sometimes it's about others seeing more. And this moment, this stretch of stillness, is less about what you're receiving, and more about what's being revealed. Not to heaven. Heaven already knows. But to everything else that once relied on you staying the same. And when they see you now, not flinching, not folding, not chasing confirmation, you become untouchable. Not because you fought. But because you stayed still. Because you didn't return to the frequency they recognize. Because you no longer fit the pattern they were hoping you hadn't outgrown. That's what spiritual maturity looks like in motionless moments. It doesn't scream. It doesn't perform. It holds. It waits. It allows itself to be seen, without shrinking back. Because something is watching. But it has no power unless you reach for it. And you don't need to. The voice of God today may not speak through volume. It speaks through absence. Not through thunder or declaration, but through the eerie stillness that refuses to explain itself. There are days when clarity comes in symbols, visions, sentences that fall like puzzle pieces into your lap. But this is not one of those days. This is not a day of revelation, it's a day of recognition. Not of what's being said, but of what's being allowed to remain unclear. Discernment is rarely tested by obvious lies. It's tested by almost truths. By quiet impressions that feel divine but leave you unsettled. By the voice that sounds familiar, but draws you slightly off-center. That's how spiritual distortion works. Not by pulling you into chaos, but by nudging you just a few degrees off course, so subtly you won't notice until you're miles from where you started. Today is fog. Not storm. Not fire. Fog. It softens the edges of every sign. Blurs the outline of every answer. And in that blur, your discernment becomes visible. Not because it suddenly sharpens, but because you start to notice how often you lean on things that only feel right. This is where every spiritual reflex gets tested. Every interpretation, every instinct, every unspoken bias that filters the voice of God through your own longing. Not every message in this stillness is sent from heaven. Some are echoes. Some are projections. Some are your own voice repeating what you wish were true. And that's what makes this moment dangerous, not because deception is loud, but because it's plausible. It wears the right tone. It arrives in your language. It references your wounds. It feels like peace, until you act on it and find yourself further away from yourself than when you started. This is why discernment can't be reduced to what resonates. Because fear sometimes resonates. And so does desire. And if you're not paying attention, you'll chase a resonance that isn't holy, it's just familiar. The old pattern with new vocabulary. The same voice that once kept you stuck now wearing prophetic clothing. This is where emotional intuition must give way to spiritual depth. Because discernment isn't how something feels, it's what it produces. And in this fog, the only way to see clearly is to stop looking so hard. To stop scanning every hour for a sign. To stop forcing clarity out of every random phrase or coincidence. That hunger to decode everything. It's the very thing being tested. Because clarity earned through force doesn't last. But clarity received after stillness? That's unshakable. The atmosphere right now isn't full of answers. It's full of filters. And most of them are yours. That's what this silence is exposing, not what's being said, but what you're overlaying onto it. And if you can't sit still long enough to let the projection dissolve, you'll miss what was actually meant for you. You'll think you're hearing God, when you're only hearing your own unresolved ache, disguised as direction. That's why today is holy. Because it doesn't give you what you want, it reveals what you reach for when you're uncertain. It shows you which voice inside you gets louder when heaven steps back. Is it your fear? Your ego? Your inner orphan looking for confirmation? Or is it the quiet place in you that doesn't flinch when the fog rolls in? Discernment is not tested when God speaks clearly. It's tested when God says nothing. When the next step doesn't show up. When the answer doesn't come. That's when your instincts surface. That's when your spiritual muscle either tightens in panic or relaxes into trust. You're being watched, not for how well you interpret the fog, but for how calmly you remain within it. Because revelation will return. The voice will speak again. The clarity will land. But only after the fog has shown you who you really are when you're not being told who to be. In Daniel 5 verse 27, a single sentence was written on the wall: "You have been weighed in the balance, and found wanting." That wasn't about sin. That was about substance. The king hadn't failed by being loud or defiant. He had simply been observed, measured, and found hollow. And that's what this moment carries too, not accusation, but weighing. Not judgment, but assessment. Not punishment, but a pause heavy enough to reveal whether your discernment comes from depth, or habit. If today feels uncertain, it's because certainty is no longer being handed to you. It's being invited from within. If the signs contradict, if the dreams blur, if the answers feel like riddles, that's not interference. That's intelligence. Divine intelligence. Strategic silence. Fog doesn't mean you're lost, it means you're being recalibrated. Not toward the loudest signal, but toward the one that doesn't change when the atmosphere does. So don't rush. Don't interpret too fast. Don't call everything confirmation. Let the moment be unresolved. Let the signal stay incomplete. If it's truth, it will find you even in silence. But if it's not, the fog will keep it out. Because real guidance doesn't always scream over your uncertainty. Sometimes, it waits to see if your discernment can outlast your impatience. Stillness is sacred, but it doesn't always feel safe. Because wherever divine silence opens a doorway, something else comes to fill the space. You may think you're alone in this pause, but you're not. You've cleared the room of obvious noise, but what remains now isn't silence. It's invitation. And what responds to that invitation depends on what's still unresolved in you. Whenever divine silence enters, counterfeit voices rise. Not to declare themselves as false, but to blend. To suggest. To mirror. They don't knock loudly. They whisper. And sometimes they whisper in your own tone. Your own memory. Your own unmet desire. You've been asking for guidance. For signs. For divine confirmation. But what shows up first in the void is often not from heaven. It's from hunger. From habit. From history. And if you're not alert, that's what you'll take as direction. This is why the test now is not about hearing. It's about filtering. You are discerning not just whether something feels spiritual, but whether it's clean. Not whether it glows, but whether it aligns. Because deception rarely comes dressed as chaos, it comes dressed as comfort. It shows up as the thing you wanted to hear, when your guard is just low enough to believe it. And here's what most people miss: interference doesn't always feel like attack. It feels like permission. Like momentum. Like clarity that arrives a little too easily. A path that opens too quickly. A connection that burns too fast. Not every open door is a sign. Some are bait. So when you're in a sacred stillness like this, when God goes quiet, and the atmosphere loses its usual rhythm, you must become more attentive, not more desperate. Because this is the moment when everything unresolved in you raises its hand and asks, are we still needed? Old temptations. Old addictions. Old identities. They surface in stillness not to reclaim you, but to test if you've truly let them go. They return wearing new names. More sophisticated language. But the same vibration. Can you feel it? This isn't about resisting sin in the traditional sense. It's about energetic precision. Can you feel the subtle shift when something enters your field that doesn't match the texture of your spirit anymore? Can you recognize when a thought pattern, a compulsion, a distraction is rising, not from within, but as interference? That's why silence is dangerous. Because it exposes your frequency. And whatever you haven't fully healed, echoes. Distractions don't need to be dramatic to be effective. An old scroll through a profile you swore you were done with. A sign from the universe that conveniently confirms your impatience. A sudden urge to fix something that isn't broken. That's how interference hides, by appearing helpful, harmless, even holy. But the question isn't, does it sound spiritual? The question is, does it bring peace? Not comfort. Not adrenaline. Not urgency. But peace. Deep, grounding peace. This is the test of energetic center. Whether you can remain still when the noise gets clever. Whether you can hear a familiar song and not dance to it. Whether you can feel the old cycle breathing at the edge of your decisions and still not step back into it. Because when you're not being fed by external signals, your own soul starts to recalibrate. And in that recalibration, everything false gets louder, just before it dies. Remember Elijah. He was hiding in the cave, desperate for God to speak. And then came the wind. The earthquake. The fire. Each one loud. Each one dramatic. Each one tempting to follow. But God wasn't in any of them. And after the fire came a still small voice. 1 Kings 19 verse 12. That's where you are now. Between the fire and the whisper. And the fire still looks convincing. But the whisper, if you can wait for it, is where the truth lives. So the work right now is not to analyze every voice. It's to recognize what doesn't belong. Not by logic, but by resonance. Not by reaction, but by stillness. This is about spiritual muscle. Subtle knowing. A quiet no that rises in your gut before your brain even understands why. Because once you say yes to something that doesn't belong, it opens the door to more. Confusion compounds. And you'll end up in a space that looks like clarity but feels hollow. That's how detours begin, not with catastrophe, but with a small agreement to something that carried the wrong frequency from the start. So pause. Listen deeper than the surface. Let every suggestion, every urge, every symbol pass through your field without attaching to it. If it's real, it will remain. If it's interference, it will dissolve. This isn't paranoia. This is refinement. And if it feels like too much, good. That means you're at the edge of a breakthrough. Because heaven doesn't test what it's not ready to trust. And trust is forged in moments like this, not when you're celebrating, but when you're still. When you're surrounded by echoes that almost feel like truth, but you choose to wait for the whisper that doesn't demand your attention, it earns it. Because the voice of God is not insecure. It doesn't compete. It doesn't perform. It waits. The space you feel right now was designed. Every breath of silence, every pause that feels just a little too long, every delayed answer you thought was overdue, it's all intentional. This isn't absence. It's alignment. You're not being ignored. You're being held. Held in the middle of a moment that was never meant to resolve quickly. What you're sensing is not the end of the conversation. It's the beginning of something heaven doesn't want to rush. Stillness isn't emptiness. It's where real messages gather weight. Before heaven speaks, it hovers. It watches. It measures the space between what you say and what you actually carry. And that's where you are now, in the quiet part of the encounter. The part just before the revelation. Not everything holy arrives loud. Not every answer comes in flame. Some only descend in rooms that have learned how not to fill themselves too fast. Habakkuk 2 verse 3 says, "Though the vision tarry, wait for it. It will not delay." And that tension, that paradox, is the very air of today. It hasn't come yet, and yet it's right on time. The silence is not passive. It's preparatory. You are not in delay. You are in weighing. Heaven is weighing your posture. Your patience. Your spiritual center. Not to punish, but to entrust. And you are part of that calculation. So if you're still standing, still listening, still refusing to fill the space with something that doesn't belong, you've already passed the first gate. You've proven that you can remain open without being overtaken. And that posture, that readiness, that's what the voice has been waiting for. Because silence isn't a punishment. It's proof that heaven trusts you enough to whisper.